Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to paint an orchid on a soft atmospheric background. And so after you sketch your orchid, the first thing you want to do is outline your orchid, just the outside of it with masking fluid. You can go all the way around, you don't need to fill it in. And once that dries, we'll be ready to start. Next, you're going to wet the entire background. You're going to make sure that the water goes in each of those little crevices in between your masking fluid. You want to do this with clean water and go all the way around your orchid. Make sure to get it nice and wet. You want that water to soak into the paper to be ready to paint your soft background. Once that background is nice and wet, you want a really nice, well, there you don't want puddles, but you want to have a really nice wet sheen on it. You're going to start dropping in color. And so for this painting, I used my Magello Mission Gold paints. And so I started dropping in a variety of greens. I did the yellow green option that was on there. I also used the sap green and the hooker's green. And I just started dropping it in. I used a reference photo, and I'm including it here in this tutorial so you can see that. But I started just dropping in the greens in the background as I saw them, and they blended in so nice. As long as your background is wet, they're going to make this really soft, blended look. And so I kept adding in greens throughout the background of the painting. Before I started the masking fluid and before I wet the background, I did lightly sketch where I saw some color variation in the reference photo. And so I could see that when I was painting, but you can't see it on the final painting. So that worked really well for me. And then I was able to kind of go along those sketch lines as a guide, adding in greens, lighter greens in some areas, and darker greens in some other areas. Next, I started adding in some pinks and some light purples in the background. I wanted to give the appearance that there were some orchids in the background that were blurry. And so I used both the crimson lake and the red violet in those. For those orchids, I also used the Van Dyke brown to show some tree limbs, some tree trunks in the background. I really felt like that darker brown color gave it a really good variation. You can see here I used the wrong color green, and so I just came back with a clean brush and I was able to pick up most of that green and to replace it with the Van Dyke green that I wanted to use. The green that I had put on by mistake was a Viridian. It was a cool green that didn't go well with my painting, and I wanted to use all the warm greens. So you can see there that I took that away with just a damp brush and went over it with the green that I wanted. So that's what I like about it. As long as you move quickly, watercolor is really forgiving. You can lift color that you don't want. You can add more color. You just have to plan ahead. And so that's one of the reasons I really, really love watercolor. So it's really important in your painting to get better dimension is to add some darker greens at the very end. You want to make sure to add those green details. It makes it look like there's depth in the background. You still want to do it while it's wet and wet to give it that soft look. And another tip to make your painting really pop is to make sure that the corners are areas that are darker. And so I added some of the darker green and even some of that Van Dyke brown there in the corner. And it made it really stand out. One other tip I want to add is that if you use some clean water and you sprinkle the paper, it'll make these little water droplets on it. You'll see that they softly diffused in and they made a really neat atmospheric look for the background. So that's one great tip. All right, here you can see that our painting is dry, and so now it is time to remove the masking fluid. Make sure that your hands are clean, even if you have some pencil lead or any kind of stray paint on your fingers, it will smear on your painting. That's so beautiful. So you just take some clean fingers and you can start just rubbing on that masking fluid that's there that's dry. I just rub back and forth and make sure that your painting is completely dry before you do this, or you're going to start smearing the paint and get it into your area that you have tried to protect. Here we have our painting. The background is all dry and the flowers are ready to be painted. So here we're going to start to paint the petals of our orchid. I'm starting with the Crimson Lake from my Magello Mission Gold set. and I'm painting all around the edge of one of the petals that I have drawn, that I have sketched before we started painting. And then I'm going to take a brush with some clean water and I rub right along that line of thicker paint that I have added. I'm also adding some of the violet from the set. I want to give some good depth and some good contrast in the petals. We don't want them to all look like they're the same color because that's not what happens in nature. So I went back and forth between the crimson lake, the red violet, and the bright clear violet from my set. And I did the areas of the most intense paint along the edge of the petal. And then I came back with a clear brush and I smoothed that edge of the paint so it would draw the color into the middle of the petal, leaving the most intense line of paint along the edge of the petal. And then as I got towards the center and the base of the petal, I just kept going with clear water to draw some of the color down, but I wanted to leave that center portion of the petal white. You want it to be the most white there at the base of the petal. So you can watch here again, I'm using the thicker portion of paint, thicker type of paint, um, and going along the edge of the petal, going all the way around. And then I'm using a brush with some clear water on it, and I'm running that along the edge of the thick amount of paint that I have already added. And so that will draw the color in, but it will leave that area where it is really clear, and it'll leave that area spare the whiteness there at the base and make the petal really look really nice. Along the middle of this petal, there is some white, some area that the color is not very intense, and so I'm using a damp brush with some clean water, and I'm just lifting up that paint there in the middle to make a really nice, the really pretty line there in the middle. This petal was a much darker petal, and so I used a thicker um, mix of the Crimson Lake, and so I added that, and I also used some of the bright clear violet to add some shadow to this petal, and so this is a very intense petal here on the back. So here I'm adding some of the green here on the stem. I'm adding this lighter olive green and along the top of the stem, and I'm using a clean brush to wet along the base of the area of paint that I've added. I want that paint to move through the water so that it's more intense on the top and lighter on the bottom. And I'm even going to add some shadow with some darker colors here. So here I'm adding shadow with a darker green along the bottom of the stem. And you can see I add the shadow here, and then again I use a clean brush to smooth that edge because I don't want any harsh lines. Now I'm going to start adding some of the veins here on the petals. I again alternate between the Crimson Lake, the red violet and the bright clear violet, depending on the petal. And so I used my Rigger brush and I added a very, very thin line, just a few across the petals. And then again, I took a clean brush, with just some clean water, and I just used that water to blend in those lines onto the petals so they'd be really, really soft. And this creates a really beautiful effect. It creates some details without being too overpowering. I'm continuing to add the fine lines along the petals. Just wherever I see them in the photo, I add either the crimson lake or one of the violet colors, and I continue to smooth it with the clean water on a brush. It's not very wet, it's just damp. So I continue to do that throughout both the orchids, on all the petals, just wherever I see. I like to go according to the reference photo, but at some point in here, I tend to have to get away from the reference photo. I'll try to be too perfectionistic and I will just try to paint exactly what I see. And I am not skilled at being that type of realistic watercolor painter yet, watercolor artist. Um, and so I have to eventually just put down the reference photo and start adding those lines and those colors where I think they need to go on my piece of art. Because that's the beautiful thing as painters. We can use a reference photo and we can try to paint what we see, but at the end of the day, this is our art and it's going to be unique. And five different artists could paint five different paintings and they would look different based on the same, even if we use the same reference photo. Now I'm going through and adding some depth to my painting, and so I'm using one of the darker colors, either the red violet or the bright clear violet, and I'm going along the edge of my petals, each of the petals in turn, and I'm painting just along that very, very edge. Again, smoothing that color into the petal with a clean, damp brush. It'll make a soft edge instead of a hard edge. So I really like the depth that this added, and I think that looks really, really good on this orchid. I'm adding some final shadow, some darker shadow here on the bottom of this orchid stem and adding that darker green there. I'm also adding some tiny details here in the middle of the orchid to give it some definition. Now I'm going to add some white details with some gouache paint that I have. I like adding the white details. I feel like it gives my flower life and adds some really neat sunlit areas on this. I like the reflection that was in the reference photo when the sun was shining on this orchid, and so I went along the edges of several of the petals and I tried to go um, on the edges of the petals where the light would be reflecting on those same petals, and so it's along the similar edges. I kept looking at the reference photo to imagine and to see where that light should be reflecting. I also added some fine white details to the center of the petals. I also mixed up a watery mixture of the white gouache and I'm adding that in splatters on the top of my orchid. This can be for raindrops or for dew or just for some more light reflection, but I really like that it adds some details and it brings life, it brings some movement to the painting. And finally, the best part, I get to sign it with my name. And to sign it with a beautiful signature and be sure to put the date on it. Some people like to do that. And our orchid is done.